What takes cinnamon rolls from good to amazing? It's not just pouring heavy cream on them, although I will cover that, but really it's knowing how what's happening inside the dough translates to the final texture, flavor, and structure of your roll. So in this video, I'm going to break down the major steps of making cinnamon rolls and answer 5 common questions using my milk bread cinnamon roll recipe as our guide. And at the end of this video, you'll understand why each step matters and use that knowledge to perfect any cinnamon roll recipe that you make. And the first thing we typically do when we make a cinnamon roll dough is to mix all the ingredients until it forms this cohesive mixture. And that brings me to my first question. How do you know how long to mix it? How do you know when to stop? Now, it doesn't matter whether you're doing the mixing using your hands on the counter or using a mixer. The purpose of this step is going to be identical for either method. And that is to, number 1, to disperse and hydrate your ingredients. Number 2, to create gluten. 3, you want to create little tiny air pockets, which can expand later on. And number 4, we're gonna create a cohesive dough that is amenable to shaping. And the visual cue you're going to use is gluten development. You can think of gluten as a network. It's kind of a flexible scaffolding that lives inside the dough when we're working with it. And that scaffolding traps gas. The strength of the scaffolding and the amount of gas inside will determine how squishy or how lofty your final bread is. So we can customize our bread based on how much gluten it contains. The thing is, gluten is not naturally occurring in wheat flour. We have to build it. And the way you can tell how much gluten is developed is through the window pane test. So let me show you how to do that. When you have low gluten development, the dough is going to feel very sticky and tear almost instantly when you stretch it. It's gonna slip off the dough hook and it's going to look very rough and uneven. If you stop here in development and try to make cinnamon rolls, it might still work, but you will likely get a roll that is very soft and squat or short. And that's because there's not enough gluten to hold the air during the subsequent rising phases, but it will essentially create something that's a little bit more akin to a very dense cake rather than a fluffy bread. Now, if you mix even further, you're going to reach medium gluten development. This is when the dough starts to gain structure, and you'll know it because it tears less easily and offers a tiny bit of resistance when it's pulled. And most cinnamon rolls should stop here. This is a great balance between nice softness from all the starches, and then because you have medium gluten development, you'll get a sufficient amount of rise as well as a little bit of chew, so you'll end up with a nice kind of super soft roll. So if you keep mixing it, you will reach high gluten development. And this is when the dough forms a translucent sheet from which light can be seen. It's got an elasticity to it as well. If you gently pull it, it should give you some resistance and bounce back in shape. For my cinnamon roll recipe, I like to push it to high gluten development because I really like chewy textures. And I think it's a good balance because cinnamon roll breads are enriched, meaning they contain eggs, butter, and sugar, and that gives the chewiness balance. And so the chewy ends up being kind of a soft mochi-like chew, which I love, rather than a kind of very chewy pizza crust type chew. Now, before we move on to letting the dough rise, I'm gonna jump back just a quick second to talk about pre-gelatinized flour paste. What is it, and do you even need it for this type of dough? Milk breads often contain a small portion of pre-cooked or pre-gelatinized flour. That is then mixed into the dough before baking. And it's often assumed that this is what gives milk bread their soft, pillowy texture. However, the team at Modernist Cuisine tested this theory and found that this paste isn't what makes the bread softer or airier. When they added it to a French bread, which is a lean dough made without sugar or fat, they saw no difference in the airiness, lightness, or softness. Instead, they concluded that sugar and fat add volume and make the crumb soft and tender. Why then are we even going through that additional step of making that pre-cooked flour paste? Well, the answer is it's going to make our bread softer and tender for longer. So the modernist team didn't see any immediate results, but after a few days, the one that did have the paste was much softer and moister. And it's thought that this is due to that pre-cooked starch having an enhanced capacity to bind water. Now, after we've made the dough, we have to let it rise or ferment. Now, this question is one I had when I started bread baking a while ago, and it's, why do we have to let it rise 2 times? What is the difference between them and what's even going on? Okay, these rises often go by different names, but the first one is typically called a bulk fermentation, and that's when we let the dough rise in one singular piece. After that, we shape it, sometimes in little pieces, or sometimes we just kind of shape it in a big ball. The second rise is called the proof or proving. Okay, what's going on in fermentation? I'm gonna give you the Cliff Notes version. Inside the dough, there are these long starches, okay? These starches are made up of sugars, and there are enzymes which go in and cut the sugars. Enzymes, you can kind of think of them as little tools. They do all sorts of things. For our purposes here, we're going to talk about enzymes that cut. These enzymes, they're present in the flour, they're present in eggs. We can add them to the dough via additives, such as if you've ever used diastatic malt powder, that's a cutter. So we're cutting the starch molecules into smaller pieces. Those little sugars that result from that are food. They're food for the yeast. So the yeast goes and they eat all those sugars, they metabolize them, and they produce carbon dioxide gas and ethanol. I believe they also produce a little bit of acid, which flavors the dough. So that alcohol, that's that kind of bready smell that you get from fermentation. And then the carbon dioxide gas, now that's important because that's what's causing our dough to rise. It's producing all this gas, and all those little pockets that we created during the mixing are now going to expand. So fermentation occurs in both bulk fermentation and proving. What is the difference between the two? Well, you can think of bulk fermentation as the majority of where that development, the dough development and structure occurs, because the gluten is aligning, the cells inside or the bubbles inside are expanding due to carbon dioxide gas, and that's where that primary structure is being built. Proving is when that structure is more refined, because what happens between those two steps is a shaping. And so in this case, we're flattening the dough and then rolling it up into spirals. That knocks out a lot of gas. So we have to replenish that gas. And that's why fermentation still has to happen for that proving step. And the extent to which you prove will also define the crumb structure. So here's how to think about it. If you want a denser, more compact roll with a kind of thick crumb, I would prove a little bit less, because the dough is going to grow as you bake it. If you want a lofter and airier roll, prove a little bit more. And what I like to do with my cinnamon rolls is prove them till about 60 to 75% of their total height, and then I get really fluffy rolls, but that's just my preference. So this next section also has to do with tailoring the final height of your roll. And that is, how do you cut the roll, or how do you roll out the dough so that you get, the cinnamon roll that you want? Okay, cinnamon roll anatomy 101. There are 4 measurements I usually think about. It's the roll height, the length of the spiral, the thickness of the bread in the spiral, and the number of total rolls I need. Here are 3 equal amounts of Play-Doh, and I'm gonna cut them into 2 rolls. The red is my control, the white line is for the width, and the black is for the length. Now I'm gonna cut them and roll them up. So look what happens when I increase the width. It gives me a taller roll. Now, if you don't need taller rolls, you can also increase the width. If you need more rolls, just make more strips. For the green, I increase the length, and this lengthened the spiral. And this is good if you like a lot of filling. However, this does decrease the thickness of the bready parts in the spiral. I personally love thicker rolls, so I'm in the red Play-Doh camp. You can also do this cool thing where you make this super long strip, one long strip, and then roll it up and you get this massive cinnamon roll. I've seen bakers do that. And my last question I got during my last office hours, which is a Ask Me Anything I hold over on my Instagram stories. And the question is pouring heavy cream over cinnamon rolls before baking a good move? Is it necessary? And the answer to this is that the water in the cream creates a steaming environment, particularly if you cover the pan while baking, rather than a dry heat that we typically use when we bake cinnamon rolls. Okay, so what does that steaming environment do? Now, I've noticed 3 things when I tried this out, and the first thing is that it softens the crust. The steam reduces the surface area of the dough that can brown, and that keeps the tops, sides, and bottoms of the roll lighter in color and softer in texture. The second thing is that it also builds flavor, but it's localized to the bottom of the pan. So as the pan heats up, the cream leaves behind milk fat along with proteins and sugars, and that mixes with the butter and residual cinnamon sugar filling. And what collects at the bottom is almost like a thin layer of condensed milk. And if we think from a chemical perspective, this makes sense. The Maillard reaction is working here because we have milk proteins and we have milk sugars, and those are going to react under heat to form these delicious flavor compounds. The third thing is that it changes the internal crumb structure of the cinnamon roll to more cake-like. If we look at my milk bread cinnamon rolls without the heavy cream, we can see distinct cotton-like bready shreds. With the heavy cream, those shreds are much shorter or almost non-existent. Now, the texture is still very soft, but just not as chewy. And when I think about that, I think it has to do with the starches gelling predominantly during the steaming step because it's at a lower temperature. The rolls are being held at a lower temperature for a little bit longer, so that starch gelation is occurring. And then when you take out the foil, if you do that and the temperature goes up, the gluten kind of sets. That's what occurs at higher temperatures. And so what you're doing is prioritizing the starch formation. My observations are that if you prefer a softer texture, a gooey-like bottom on your rolls, or a cakey internal structure rather than a bready texture, you should definitely try this. If you're making canned cinnamon rolls, this is probably the easiest way to upgrade them and kind of provide insulation so that they don't dry out, and in the end get a really soft and delicious dessert. So this is kind of new territory for me, which is yeasted breads. And this video was a little bit difficult for me to make because bread making is very subjective. So not only do we have to cover things like technique and precision, but we also have to go over how to be flexible and to respond to things that happen and evolve, because the dough is it has living organisms in it that we need to work with. But yeah, I finished my milk bread cinnamon roll recipe, and the good thing is that it's what I call a master recipe, which means that I can now, have fun innovating and make flavor modifications and things like that should come later on. Which, by the way, if that sort of conversation interests you, recipe development, behind the scenes, I did start a newsletter on Substack. I very casually go into those things. So yeah, go ahead and check that out, and happy baking. Get a wave. Hey, wave, where's your paw? Happy baking. This is Cookie, by the way. Why are you looking at me?